A typical question every player has to ask themselves is, when they're hitting a first serve, how hard do they want to hit it, and how often do they want to get their serve in? What do they want their first service percentage to be? Howard Brody, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, did a study that showed, let's say your maximum surge speed was 100 miles an hour. That's as hard as you could hit it, and you got it in 50% of the time. If you dropped your serve speed to 90 miles an hour, so in other words, you hit 90% as hard as you could, your serve was now 30% more likely to go in. So in other words, at 90 miles an hour, your serve would go in 65% of the time, again, as opposed to 100 miles an hour, where your serve would only go in half the time, 50% of the time. A lot of players like to step up to the baseline, toss the ball, and just hit as hard as they can. It's fun to go for the ace. But there are a number of advantages for dropping your first service speed down a little bit. Consistency is one of those. Like Dr. Brody proved in his study, if you drop your speed a little bit, you'll get much more consistent. That's huge. But there's also some other advantages I want to talk about. The first is variety. Keeping your opponent guessing every single time you step up to the baseline for a first serve is an enormous advantage. You want your opponent to have to worry about where you're going to put the serve, how hard you're going to hit it, and what kind of spin you're going to put on the ball. So if you hit at a base service speed, let's say 90 miles an hour, and you can go up from there as well as down, your opponent is not going to know how hard you're going to hit it. If you just rip it, let's say 100 miles an hour every single time, that's one less thing your opponent has to worry about. Now he only has to worry about the placement and the spin, and maybe even fewer than that, because if you're hitting as hard as you can, you might sacrifice, you might lose some of that other variety. You won't have as much spin, and you might not be able to control the placement as well. Let me talk about Pete Sampras for a minute to emphasize how important variety is and how much more important variety is than power. Pete Sampras' average first serve speed was about 120 miles an hour, which is certainly fast, but it wasn't nearly as fast as some of the other guys he played against. Now that said, Pete had arguably, and in my opinion, the best serve ever, because he combined, he had some pace, but he also had spin and placement, and those three things made his serve devastating. His opponents never knew what was coming. They didn't know how hard he was going to hit it, they didn't know where it was going, and he could put that serve on a dime, and they didn't know what kind of spin he was going to put on the ball. So Pete's example is instructive for everybody else. He achieved the greatest serve of all time through variety and not power, and chances are you can attain your best possible serve through variety as opposed to power as well. The second point I want to make, and this sort of goes back to Dr. Brody's findings, is that up until about the top 500 players in the world, tennis is entirely a game of errors. It's about winning the battle of errors. If you make more errors than your opponent, you're probably going to lose, and if your opponent makes more errors than you, you are most likely going to win. In my opinion, missing a high number of first serves is a huge error. For most players, their second serve is a defensive shot, and if you take a little bit off your first serve, it's still going to be a weapon, and if you can get it in 30% more often, that means you're on offense 30% more of the time. And let's face it, you're probably not facing Agassi, so you don't have to worry about taking that little bit extra off your first serve. The other thing this does is it gives you a psychological advantage. If you have a very high first serve percentage, your opponent's going to notice that. That's going to put a lot of pressure on him to serve well and hold serve, because he figures he's going to have a tough time breaking you. So the next time you go out to serve, think about taking a little bit off your first serve. Maybe put a little bit more spin on the ball so it gets pulled into the court. That might allow you to place it a little bit better, and that should help you serve more effectively on your first serve.